Okay, welcome back to another week, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. This week, we are going to be talking about Persia and the Persian Wars with Greece, and obviously Greece. So let's jump right into it. Now, the age of disruption that followed the Bronze Age collapse lasted from 1100 BCE to 800 BCE. Now, it's not until the 9th century that we finally start to see the reemergence of imperial states in Southwest Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean. If you, like me, learned about the Persian Wars from the Greek perspective, or even so much as heard of the movie 300, you might be inclined to view the Persian Empire as some kind of like first order level big baddie. But that honestly couldn't be further from the truth. Persia is often branded as the antagonist because of their wars with Greece and the general Hellenistic central take on that particular branch of ancient history. Hellenistic is what Greece was called before it was united and called Greece. And, I hope that in these lectures I can show you that, one, Persia was really fascinating in that it has a very unique and amazing history, but that it's so much more than just the big bad guy in a Zack Snyder movie. Now, our story actually begins in the mid 500s BCE. The big kid in town was this empire called the Median Empire, and they had a reputation for being really mean to their subjects. So, people from the south, Persians, and in particular this guy named Cyrus, they wanted to have a go at conquering them. Except Cyrus didn't really have a big army, but what he did have is that he garnered a lot of military and political support from some of the annoyed Median nobility. Now, how did he manage this? How did he manage to get, Median nobility on his side, other than the fact that they were annoyed with the regime? The way that he did this is that he actually promised his new allies that their people would be treated as full equals to the Persians. And unlike some empires, he actually followed through with this, which makes it really unique. Not only that, but when he defeated the Medians, he made it a point to forgive the defeated enemies, and he also treated them as equals too. So when he defeats the Median Empire and takes over it, he doesn't even bother to, punish or burn or totally destroy all of the Median Empire. He just pulls it into, he says, okay, this is a part of Persia now, and he actually treats his enemies and his allies as equals to the Persians, giving them the same type of rights and stuff like that. But wait, there's more. In the following years, he actually conquered Anatolia and he crossed the Tigris River and then also went into Babylon and conquered the Babylonians. Now, not only was he nice to the Babylonians, he did not punish them even after, conquering them, because Cyrus doesn't do that. He famously freed the captive Jewish population was there, and he even went further and helped them build a second temple, which, like, just wow. Okay, I mean, the Jews are notoriously hated throughout history, and here's Cyrus the Great from the Persian Empire, who's supposed to be this big baddie, freeing the Jewish population from the Babylonians. Now, Cyrus definitely wins my award for being the nicest world-conquering empire builder in history. And those two things don't usually go together, okay? When you build an empire, you're not typically nice about it. But he was, so, props to him for actually pulling it off. Now, Cyrus himself, had created, a merry little empire. And by little, I do mean it was massively huge. If you can take a look at the map over here, you can actually tell, and it has on there everything that Cyrus conquered. Okay, so the Persian Empire, even though this is in different colors, you can see that he conquered the Median Empire, he conquered Lydia, he conquered Egypt, he conquered Babylon, he conquered all of these places. So you're talking his empire was huge. No empire in history had been so sprawling before this. And the thing ran from the Indus Valley all the way to the Hellespont. Like, whew, man, that is a massive empire. But of course, Cyrus couldn't live forever, and we're actually not done with Persian expansion just yet. So after Cyrus dies, his son Cambyses ended up going on to conquer Egypt. So Cyrus started it, but it's Cambyses that actually finishes conquering Egypt. Now the Egyptians were less than thrilled with this, because Cambyses didn't exactly share his father's kindness, as he famously killed the super sacred bull of Apis, among with many other bad things that he did, like imprisoning their kind and burning the mummies of their ancestors and looting their temples, you know, the things that you do when you conquer a place. So the Egyptians were really not happy about this. Of course, neither were most of the Persians, so Cambyses is later assassinated and replaced by Darius the First, or Dartius. It just kind of depends on where you're from and how you want to say it. Either is correct. And Darius the First, he puts things back on track for the Persian Empire. Of course, his first order of business is going to be suppressing any type of revolt, which there was, as the result of the assassination of Cambyses. Because even though the Egyptians didn't really like him, and to be honest, most of the Persians didn't, there were still revolts throughout the empire. And with only a small army and against all odds, Darius actually did it. He actually managed to suppress these revolts. So now that the Persian Empire is nice and resettled, I want to spend some time talking to you about their fantastic system of bureaucracy, because it is incredibly unique and it's actually just going to be mirrored by Alexander the Great in, a couple hundred years. And it's something that, truly is unique and actually works or tends to work. Now, the great king, or the king of kings, like Cyrus or Darius, they were the ruler of the entire empire. However, because their empire was so sprawling, they had to figure out how to delegate. So local power was actually delegated to a series of people called satraps. And they're a lot like mini kings, and they, or like a governor. And they were picked from the local nobility who ruled the 50 or so Persian provinces. Okay, so in the provinces within the Persian Empire, there were about 50 of these satraps. They were kind of like mini kings or like a governor, kind of like how we have, a governor over the states, that same type of concept. And they kind of ruled over the local, area, but they always had to pay taxes or run things past, the king of kings, the great king, Cyrus or Darius, whoever was in charge at the time. So that's kind of how their bureaucracy worked. And it worked great, because how in the world can you, as one person, manage an empire that is so sprawling? The answer is you really can't. And that's why, the Persians set it up this way. Of course, with any political system, there are always problems. And we get one of those in 498 BCE. There was a collection of Ionian Greek city-states on the coast of Anatolia that revolted from Persia. Now, they did this partially for political reasons, but also because the Ionians and the surrounding people didn't really care for the rulers that the Persians had chosen to govern them. And this is part of the problem, right? While Darius and, Cyrus were, kind and accepting, that didn't necessarily mean that the satrap of your area was the same. And yeah, so for whatever the case be it, they essentially revolted for political reasons. They didn't like the rulers over them. And the important part is that the revolt happened, because this is where we get the start of the Persian Wars. Eventually, Athens is going to get involved as the narrative turned from, initial politics towards the Ionians basically saying, hey, let's fight the oppressive and evil Persians for our freedom. And it's understandable to see why the message changed the way that it did, especially in this particular situation, because, as they started to revolt, their satrap, really tightened up, the way that he ruled the country, and he did become oppressive. So it's easy to see how it transitioned from, we just don't politically like being a part of the Persian Empire, to, hey, we want to be free from the Persian Empire. But part of the problem is when you say, hey, let's fight the oppressive and evil Persians for our freedom, it misrepresents Persia as a whole. Fight for freedom? Fine. But oppressive and evil? Hardly. There is a mountain literal mountain of evidence to show how much Cyrus and Darius did for the well-being of all of the people in their empire. Not only were they welcoming of multiple different cultures, but they restored buildings in the places that they conquered. They created roads and a postal system. They promoted education and were notably egalitarian and for women's rights. Now, this again doesn't guarantee that the satrap of your particular province, right, isn't going to do something stupid or mean to you, as, is what exactly happened with the Ionians. But all things considered, living in the Persian Empire was pretty great. And if you're, from somewhere that's a part of Western classical tradition, like, let's say, America, which most of you probably are, you might have a different, more aggressive, warmongery picture of Persia because of the Ionian Revolt and the subsequent wars with Greece. And the reason why we're going over this is because I want you guys to understand that that was the exception to the rule. Okay, so like typically people in the Persian Empire were fine with who was ruling over them. And the Persians were, really, they were really accepting. And the Ionian Revolt and the wars with Greece are kind of like an anomaly. Oh my goodness, words are hard today. So while all of those anti-Persian settlements are valid for the Greeks, it's unfair and just flat out incorrect to think that the entire empire was just plain evil. That's just not true. The Persians were the first and arguably one of the most successful examples of a fair, multi-ethnic, internally peaceful and prosperous nation. And that's seriously impressive. Even calling them Persia kind of does them a disservice because the Persians were only one people in this empire of many peoples. But back to my point now that I've gotten off on a rant, my bad. All of that cooperation and trans-imperial trade, it made Persia fabulously rich. And you can see this in the abundance of art that they have during this time, the statuary, the palaces that they, built. They were all very, intricate and beautiful. Also, they had a justice system in Persia that was quite extensive and effective in ensuring fair treatment for all, mostly for all. Obviously, there are always people who get left behind. But Persia also had this rich cultural heritage, okay? And it kind of goes back to, they have trade, it made them rich, they have a justice system, so that way, there are laws and you have to follow those laws and that there is, punishment when you break them. And then you have religion, right? Because religion is a big thing. And Persia had a religion called Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism. And this is the main Persian religion. Now, what Zoroastrianism is a very complex monotheistic belief system that heavily stresses the duality between good and evil. Sound familiar? Of course it does, because it arguably played a really strong role in influencing the later development of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, right? Which also do the same thing. Monotheistic belief system that stresses the duality between good and evil. Now, it's easily a topic all in its own, but this is a history course, now world religions. So just know for now that it existed and that, it played a larger influence. Now, all in all, the century and a bit that followed the formation of the empire was honestly pretty great. But then things start to deteriorate, as they do. And this is a result of disputes over the throne and conflicts all across the empire, a lot like the ones in Greece. And it left the central power of Persia weakened. And the strength of the empire continued to fray during the following century. Now, we aren't going to talk about that just yet because, when we talk about the collapse or the fraying of the Persian Empire, we're going to talk about that when we discuss Alexander the Great in 2 weeks, okay? So I'm going to kind of hold off on that for right this moment, and we're going to get back to Persia and its relevance to the Persian Wars before we talk about the stuff that we're going to talk about in 2 weeks, because I could digress. Okay, so back to the Persia that's actually relevant to our stories about the Persian Wars. Now, when Persia did what all empires do and started to expand outwards into Anatolia, the Ionians did what subjects do, and they revolted. We've already talked about this, right? Now, the Athenians, they went to help, except they failed to defeat the Persians. But what they did do is they successfully made them very angry, which, now that I think about it, is probably worse. No, I'm definitely thinking it was worse. As a result, the Persian king at the time, Darius, he decided to basically say, all right, screw those guys. I'm going to sail right over to Athens and deliver a strongly worded letter expressing my disapproval. And to make sure that he got his point across, he also sent his army. So Darius, he sends, roughly 25,000 of his most heavily armored men to the coast of Marathon, where the Athenians do actually meet him for battle. By all accounts, the Persians should have easily beaten the Athenians and gone on to conquer the rest of Greece without problem. They had a much larger army, they were much more well trained, but that didn't happen. See, the Athenians actually played it really smart, and they knew that one of the main advantages of the Persian army was the Persian cavalry. So they waited until the Persian cavalry wasn't with the Persian army, and then the Athenians attacked, and they actually managed to envelop the Persian army and won the battle. Now, this came as a real surprise to the rest of Greece because right now, in this moment, Athens is really a dinky little polis. A polis is a city-state. Okay, we'll talk about that in the next lecture when we get into the Persian Wars. But Athens was a nobody at this moment in time. So for a nobody, right, a dinky little polis like Athens to actually beat the Persians, it's almost like that tale of the Americans who were a dinky little, colony, defeating the British Empire. It's very similar. Now what this does is it sets the stage for the next part of the Persian Wars. The part that we're going to talk about in the next lecture. Okay, so we talked about Cyrus, we talked about Darius. Darius is the one who starts the Persian Wars in Greece, not only with the Ionian Revolt, but going to put it down, getting the Athenians involved, sailing over to Athens, fighting this battle. That is the first part of the Persian Wars. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about Xerxes and the Battle of Thermopylae and all of that good stuff. So we will get into that in the next lecture, and I will see you all in a little bit.